Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization. Today, we are going to be looking at the Cross versus the Crown, 1095 to 1300. So grab a pen and paper, a tablet or a keyboard, and let's get going. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain how the papacy claimed universal authority in a fragmented feudal world. You will analyze church-state tensions over power, legitimacy, and jurisdiction. Describe how monarchs in France and England built centralized bureaucratic states. Evaluate how structural changes weakened papal supremacy, and trace how the conflict laid the foundations for the rise of dynastic monarchies and increasing royal control over church structures and religious authority. In the last few lectures, we've been looking at feudal Europe. We saw that under the Carolingians, church and state seemed to work together for the most part. Popes crowned kings, and kings protected the church. We saw, though, that after Charlemagne, his empire began to break apart and was soon replaced by regional powers, breaking up the centralized ruling structure that had existed. We saw that under the wave of repeated barbarian assaults, that feudalism began to take hold. Lords sought to control private justice, armies, and control their own little land or domains. Loyalties under feudalism became very personal and localized, yielding a map that looked similar to the one that you see in front of you. During these fragmented and chaotic times, only the church remained as a universal. It alone preserved any sense of universal law, learning, or spiritual authority. In a fragmented world, only the papacy or the Pope offered continuity. And it was from this period that a new vision of Christian dominion began to emerge. Church reformers began to promote the idea of a new order, one led by popes and not by emperors. During this period, the church began to build courts. It began to promote its own type of law called canon law and its own clerical hierarchy. In this fragmented period, the church began to claim authority over kings in moral and spiritual matters. The Crusades, as we saw in our last lecture, had elevated papal power. Popes mobilized armies across Europe, and spiritual authority directed physical forces. But the Crusades had cut both ways. The Crusades had also led to royal authority growing stronger as well. Partly by financing crusades through greater taxation, partly through participating in the crusades themselves, royal power and prestige had expanded. And a shared religious cause between pope and monarch became a contest for control. Who would be the ultimate authority in Christendom? popes as the vicar or representative of Christ, or kings as a sovereign ruler. As we'll see in this lecture, the unity of Christianity was going to break down again, but this time it was going to be between cross and crown. Beginning around the year 1000, Europe underwent a very profound reform movement. Reformers look back over the last century or two as Europe had been in crisis, and they saw a church that had declined from its spiritual roots. And they saw a church in crisis. The clergy were too wealthy, they believed. The clergy was too undisciplined, and the clergy was too tied to politics. Oftentimes, they complained that bishops acted like nobles who were more loyal to the king than they were to Rome. And so reformers began to call for moral renewal, for clerical celibacy, which had lapsed in many places, and an end to simony, or the buying of offices. Most of all, they demanded that the church break free from lay or secular control. This was easier said than done because often bishops were also lords. They held land titles. They held vassalage from kings. And oftentimes, because bishops or even abbots, the heads of monasteries, were major landowners, rulers claimed the right to appoint them. And so if we look at a map of the Holy Roman Empire, we can, and this is from a slightly later time, but we can see that all of these areas in red, which are a substantial part of the empire, all of these were held by churchmen. So there were some of the church was one of the largest landholders in the medieval Holy Roman Empire. And so from the perspective of the Holy Roman Emperors, this was like they needed control over this. And so the core issue really boiled down to the issue of investiture, which sounds fancy and sounds like something related to stocks, but in this case it's not. It goes to the practice of kings naming bishops to important positions in their realm, and then investing them or giving them the symbols of their authority, the staff. Okay, so this was a symbol of a bishop's authority, and the king invested them with it or gave it to them. And then they could become bishop and take on control of these important lands. From the perspective of reformers, this was a form of spiritual corruption. From the perspective of the kings, well, this was just good politics. And so a collision loomed. Were these high offices going to be a spiritual office or a feudal power? Tensions around the issue of lay investiture finally exploded in 1075, when Gregory VII, a reforming pope, issued a decree banning lay investiture. Gregory claimed that only popes could appoint bishops or depose rulers. The Holy Roman Emperor at that time, Henry IV, saw this as a direct attack on imperial authority. He needed loyal bishops to hold his empire together, he believed. And losing investiture meant losing control over both church and nobility. And so Henry IV declared that the Pope was no Pope at all and that he was deposed. For his part, Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry. And so the issue of excommunication, where a pope essentially declares that someone's no longer part of the church, undermined the legitimacy of Henry IV. As you can see, the Holy Roman Empire at this time was really a patchwork of different principalities, kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, bishoprics, you name it. A real fractious hodgepodge of different territories. And the excommunication of Henry, which implied that he was no longer a Christian and nobody really needed to follow their oaths to him, proved to be a real problem for him. Rebellious dukes started to rise up, and cracks began to show in Henry's authority, and he risked being driven from office or losing the crown altogether. And so, 2 years later, in 1077, Henry walked across the Alps, not to depose the Pope, but as a penitent. He learned that Gregory was in a palace in Canossa in the mountains, and in the middle of winter, the Holy Roman Emperor did penance for 3 days outside, seeking absolution and eventually being granted it by Gregory. And so this was a very symbolic moment, a moment where spiritual power seemed to triumph over imperial power. A type of compromise was eventually reached in 1122. It's called the Concordat of Worms. And essentially, what the Concordat did was state that the popes did have the right to appoint bishops, but that the emperor retained the right to give them symbols of their secular authority. So like a scepter, for instance, would be a symbol of secular authority, but it was the church who would give the bishop his symbols of spiritual authority. But the church did retain the right to nominate the bishop in the first place, with some oversight on the part of the emperor. And so this set a type of precedent. The church and the state would now have their defined roles, but tensions were still going to remain. Investiture might be settled, but the question was, who really reigns over Christendom? So clearly, Canossa and the Concordat of Worms was a major win for the papacy. Now, before we proceed any further, it's important to understand why and how popes claimed such authority. It may sound like maybe an obvious thing or something that's not that interesting, but it's important to understand where these claims came from. And they go back to an incident recorded in the Gospels that involved St. Peter and Jesus. And popes during this period really leaned into this particular verse. And the verse in question appears in Matthew 16:9. And this is Jesus speaking to Peter. In it he says, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loose in heaven. And so popes had claimed for a long time to be the successors to St. Peter. According to church tradition, Peter had been beheaded in Rome. He had founded the church in Rome. And so the popes saw themselves as the successors of Peter, and therefore they saw these verses as applying to them. But what do these verses even mean? Well, they're a bit obscure, but in the Middle Ages, popes claimed that they had been granted essentially the keys to heaven. That if they chose to, they could grant access to heaven to some, or they could deny access. And so this was a type of divine authority that had been given to popes. And so the popes could bind or they can loose both sins, but also laws. And in medieval thought, this gave the Pope's jurisdiction both over spiritual things, which wasn't in too much dispute by this point, at least not in the Western Church, but also temporal. In other words, non-spiritual matters. And so this essentially, if taken to their extreme, gave popes absolute authority over spiritual and non-spiritual matters. Now, popes relied on two different tools in order to persuade kings and other rulers to comply with their wishes. The first was excommunication, which is what Gregory had wielded against Henry. And basically what excommunication does is it bans somebody from receiving the sacraments. So this would be the bread and wine at communion, which Christians take, in which Christians, Catholic Christians believed gave you grace and essentially gave you access into heaven. And when a ruler was excommunicated, this meant he was really no longer part of the church. This would completely undermine his spiritual legitimacy under feudal norms. Remember, in feudalism, you swore an oath to God, but well, if this person you had sworn an oath to wasn't actually a Christian anymore, then you weren't really bound by that oath, and you could maybe rebel against them. And so sometimes the popes would use that. But then there was an even greater power that they would occasionally wield, kind of like the nuclear option. And this was an interdict. And this was a ban on the sacraments throughout the entire kingdom. And so maybe in the first case, it would only spiritually affect the ruler, but in this case, it affects everybody who's underneath his jurisdiction. And so if we put ourselves in the mind of medieval people, well, if you're not getting the sacraments, then if you die, well, you're dying in a state of sin. And, bad things are going to happen. You're going to go to hell, or, bad things, you can't baptize your children, and then now they're not part of the church, and you're not getting the sacraments, so you're not getting grace, and, priests can't come and bless you when you're dying, and oh my God, you can imagine the torment that this might cause people in the pressure that they might start to put on their leaders. And so papal sanctions could really strike at the whole feudal core. As long as there were nobles who felt that they could or should rise up against the king, excommunication would be a powerful weapon. And not just a spiritual one. Remember, this would have been a political weapon as well. The height of papal authority came under Innocent III, who was pope from 1198 to 1216. Innocent would embody the height of medieval papal authority. Under Innocent's pontificate, there were major interventions in the royal successions of different kingdoms. Innocent would excommunicate King John of England, Emperor Otto IV, and Count Raymond of Toulouse. In addition to this, Innocent forced the King of England and the King of Aragon, which was then a kingdom in Spain, to recognize him as their feudal overlord. So essentially, the Kingdom of Aragon and England were put underneath direct papal authority, and he also pressured Philip II of France to take back his wife. To accomplish all this, Innocent made wide use of interdicts and excommunications as tools to gain influence. As mentioned earlier, these sanctions struck right at these rulers' feudal legitimacy and not only threatened their souls, but also their thrones. The peak of Innocent's career came when he called the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which was a major church council, and there he reaffirmed papal supremacy over all of Christendom and asserted that the Pope was less than God, but more than a man. And so this council codified Innocent's vision of one shepherd, one flock under Rome, essentially declaring that the Pope was sovereign over all of Christendom. During this period, though, kings were also growing more powerful. Kings were beginning to rule not just lands, but states. They were increasingly consolidating their power beyond just feudal customs. We can see an example of this here in France. When the French dynasty, the Capets, came to the throne in 907, their territories amounted to nothing more than the areas outside of Paris, a few little scraps of territory, and they were by no means the largest, the most powerful. Actually, they were quite impotent compared to some of the greater nobles of the realm. You can see their territories here in 907, very, very small. You can see that some of the dukes and some of the counts of the realm had much more land. This began to change throughout this period, through marriage, through inheritance, through war. Kings were gradually able to consolidate more and more of their control and rule more and more of it directly, or at least have lesser nobles become more and more dependent on this. By 1223, for instance, the King of France ruled directly a great deal of France. An even greater share were nobles who were directly tied to him and who he could directly control. And very few areas would have been outside their direct control by this point. And so this was significant not just for kings, but what it really meant was that feudal lords weren't able to challenge kings in the same way. Kings now had greater and greater direct control over their countries, over the taxation. They could tax more of their subjects, over justice, royal judges and officials could impose the king's law over more of the land, and also warfare. More and more power within the realm would directly flow through the crown. The bureaucrats that now administered the realm would answer directly to the king and no longer to lords or bishops, as they had in an earlier time. With greater revenues, kings could afford to keep standing armies that would replace the feudal levies, and these soldiers would serve for pay and not for land. And so this meant that kings wouldn't have to try to cajole reluctant lords to come to battle, and that more and more force was directly under the control of kings. And it became harder for feudal lords to challenge kings. Royal courts and written laws extended further and further out, and loyalty was increasingly purchased with money and not by giving out lands. And so this meant that kings could rule independently of their lords more and more so. And as a result, they had less and less to fear from popes who could no longer hope that lords would just overthrow kings that were now excommunicated. And what this meant was that monarchs became increasingly assertive and increasingly challenged papal interference. One example of this is King Louis IX of France expanded royal courts and placed these above church courts, which hadn't been the case prior to this time. Edward I of England thought that it was his prerogative to tax the clergy, who had previously been exempt without papal consent. And when Boniface VIII issued an edict to stop him, Edward retaliated by seizing church lands, and the Pope was forced to fold. And so what began to happen is increasingly throughout the 13th century is that papal threats were routinely ignored, and excommunications began to lose some of their power. And a pattern began to emerge of monarchs asserting control over church affairs within their own realms. The tug of war between crown and tiara culminated in a dramatic clash. And this would involve King Philip IV of France, whom we've spoken of in our last lecture. He was the Templar king, versus Pope Boniface VIII. Philip was one of the strongest monarchs in Europe, and Philip attempted to tax the clergy of his realm without papal consent. Infuriated, Boniface issued an edict Unum Sanctum in 1302. In it, he claims it is necessary for salvation to be subject to the Roman pontiff. This was one of the most extreme claims of papal supremacy in church history. And it set up a strong clash of wills, just as it had done at Canossa in 1077. In that case, though, the emperor had folded to the Pope, but this time Philip felt that he was strong enough not to back down and not to kneel. In fact, Philip retaliated against the Pope, who made these strong claims. And he sent his agents to seize Boniface in 1303. During this encounter, one of the agents acting on behalf of Philip actually beat the Pope and essentially had him imprisoned. And so this was a very humiliating defeat for the papacy at the hands of the monarchy. And Boniface actually died shortly after. He was released, but shortly thereafter he died of some of the treatment that he received at the hands of Philip's men. And this marked a turning point where powerful monarchs now increasingly dictated terms to the church. Throughout the feudal period, ambitious popes had dreamed of a federation of Christian kings under their spiritual leadership. But this vision depended on a fragmented feudal world. Early on, excommunication worked because kings feared losing noble support. That hope faded with the fall of Boniface VIII. Structural shifts weakened papal supremacy. Monarchs built bureaucracies, courts, and armies. Kings began to take control of national churches and to tax them. Papal power now faced not weak feudal monarchs, but strong centralized states. In 1309, the papacy itself was moved out of Rome to Avignon, a territory that sat just on the French border. And this would put the papacy under very heavy French influence and marked a period that came to be known as the Babylonian captivity of the church, which would last for several decades and see the center of Christianity moved out of Rome. And so popes had gone from moral arbiters to royal captives. Papal monarchy lost its independence. The future would belong to dynastic monarchs. But just as the dream of a Christian commonwealth was drawing to a close, the rise of commercial wealth was ascending. The very Italy that saw Pope and Emperor clash now became the cradle of a new revolution. Italian cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa emerged as hubs of trade and finance. Urban growth and commerce began to undermine feudal norms. A new class began to rise, a class that would draw power not from land or from the sacred, but from capital and from wealth. The middle class was beginning to emerge, and they would usher in a world of contracts, markets, and merchants. More than anyone, they would begin to dismantle the feudal order. They answered neither to pope nor to king, but only to prophet. And in our next lecture, we're going to turn to the commercial revolution and see how trade, towns, and monies would begin to break the mold of the medieval world.